Hello, good morning. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Luciana Reck Miranda. I'm the PI of this project, and I teach at the Universidade Federal de São Carlos in Brazil, and I'm from Recife. And it's been some years that I researched silent cinema in Brazil. My paper is called Stage and Screen Attractions at Teatro Santa Helena in São Paulo. Today, I will present some initial findings of the research I have been developing on exhibition practices in the city of São Paulo, specifically at the Teatro Santa Helena, over 1927. I put aside for a while my research on film prologues in Rio de Janeiro's Cinelândia in 1926, but my focus continues the same, to investigate the relationship between stage and screen attractions in order to understand these intermedial relations in which the movie theater holds a privileged space. The decision to study Teatro Santa Helena in 1927 is guided by two main objectives. On the one hand, 1927 is a particularly significant year for Santa Helena and for the São Paulo film exhibition market in general, since it comprises the period of the partnership between Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Empresas Reunidas, owner of the Santa Helena. It was the opportunity for MGM to employ new exhibition practices, including stage and screen attractions. On the other hand, studying Teatro Santa Helena in 1927 allows me to expand my research on Luiz de Barros. Besides having staged film prologues in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, Luiz de Barros has developed throughout his career stimulating intersections between theater and cinema, stage and screen, working as a film and theater director, as well as a set designer in films, plays, and other kinds of entertainment. In 1927, he is in São Paulo, working at Teatro Santa Helena and at other theaters. I'm afraid this presentation will be a bit fragmented, or at least split in two parts, but as I said, it is an initial approach that I hope will become more articulate in the following steps. The lavish Teatro Santa Helena was located in the Palacete Santa Helena in São Paulo city center. The theater had 1,300 seats, located in stalls, balcony, and gallery. Its grand opening was held in November. Its grand opening was held in November 1925 with a theater company headed by actor Julian Costa, one of the most prestigious Brazilian actors at the time. In the following month, December, the theater became a cine teatro, offering daily stage and screening programs. The stage attractions quickly acquired the status of popular entertainment, such as the miniature circus with animals, which substituted Costa's theater company. Teatro Santa Helena and Cine República were the two main movie theaters belonging to Reunidas, a company that owned practically all of the major theaters in the city of São Paulo since 1924. The partnership between Reunidas and MGM started in January 1927, giving rise to the company Reunidas Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Limitada. The premiere of the film The Volga Boatman took place less than 10 days later at the Cine República. The term mise-en-scène seems to cover both the organization of stage performances, like the French singer who embodies the character of Norma Talmadge in the prologue of Kiki, and the creation of proper atmosphere. And the creation of proper atmosphere through setting and lighting, especially prepared to enhance the appreciation of the films. In the screening of The Big Parade, for example, which had no stage performance, great attention was paid to the lighting, which received praise in the press. To the newspaper Correio Paulistano, The only new thing actually introduced by the Americans was, I quote, the house lighting during screenings by means of a multicolored lamp hidden within the central area of the vault. End of quote. In the second half of the 20s, Luiz Barros' career goes through a variety of stage screen intersections, including theater, cinema, film prologues, decorative work in movie theaters, carnival balls. All of them narrowed his working relationships with exhibitors and with theater owners, which proved to be essential to ensure the continuity of his activities over so many decades. Another aspect of theatrical culture that I believe will be a substantial contribution to broaden the discussion on theatrical culture in Brazil concerns the numerous references to films and to film culture in stage plays, in Brazilian stage plays, written and or staged by Luiz Barros and by other authors and companies.
É o senhor músico? Ah, coisa velha, que a gente está muito necessitado de uma moda. Capitão, tem um tal de um baile perfumado, que eu não sei tocar direito não, mas vou fazer uma meia sola aqui para ver se é do seu agrado.
It's quite broad, given the various references that a film can make to literature, painting, theater, etc. Consider Perfumed Ball, its soundtrack brings simultaneous references to ancient local rhythms, such as maracatu, and also to the world pop rock, affirming both a local and a global identity from the past to the present. Again, turn to the point of possible methodological approach to this research. More recently, some ways pointed out by Agnes Pethő have shown to be very compelling. In her book, Cinema and Intermediality, The Passion for the In-Between, Pethő presents a debate about what she calls roads along the historical research axis of intermediality in the film, mapping 5 paradigms. Of course, we cannot discuss the 5 paradigms right now. However, we can at least indicate that all of them somehow seem to suggest interesting avenues for this research. Just remembering quickly, for example, the first paradigm concerns the film as a synesthetic experience. And an example, among others, is Eisenstein in his montage theory, assume at a given moment the film as music for the eyes. Certainly not by chance, there is a film in the Árido movie filmography, a film entitled Cartola, Music for the Eyes, by Lírio Ferreira and Hilton Lacerda. It should be remembered that Cartola was a great Brazilian popular musician. Therefore, according to Eisenstein, there would be a rhythmic structure that can be transposed from music to film. In short, there would be a possible match between music and film by synesthesia, the crossing of sensations. The first paradigm, related to film as synesthetic experience, seems to be one of the most exciting for my purposes, as it explores the relationship between film and music from various branches, including not only Eisenstein, but also contemporary scholars, for example, Michel Chion, Rick Altman, David Bordo, and his reflections, musical analysis in the cinema. There are many possibilities indeed. However, one of the propositions of Agnes Pethő that currently seems to respond directly to the epistemological and methodological problems of this research concerns the understanding of the world as a media maze. The music we hear on the soundtrack found in the scenes is strongly influenced by the urban musical culture from Recife, arising with the Manguebeat in the 1990s. This dilemma, to recall Nagib's term discussed at the beginning of this communication, seems to combine with the essential and the structural modes of intermediality in the cinema, as proposed by Agnes Pethő, who explained the two modes as follows. One, a sensual mode that invites the viewer to literally get in touch with the world portrayed not at a distance but at the proximity of entangled synesthetic sensations, and result in a cinema that can be perceived in the terms of music, painting, architectural forms, or haptic textures. And two, a structural mode that makes the media components of the cinema visible and exposes the layers of multimediality that constitute the fabric of the cinematic medium, revealing at the same time the mesh of their complex interactions.
Say something. I have chosen to address certain musical numbers of Brazilian films in order to try to use intermediality as a critical category, given the fact that these films are privileged arenas of different media strategies. As you may know, Brazilian cinema of this period involves strong connections with several cultural practices of that time, from the Hollywoodian cinema as the prevailing international standard for choreography, staging, and acting, to the domestic influences of radio and popular music in the presentation of songs and singers, as well as recurrent musical routines and several forms of comic staging of the popular theatre / reviews / vaudeville. I don't know how to name that. I will name that as review. The extent of activities connected with cinema brings, therefore, the challenge of dealing with theory and history of many related areas. I have received a lot of suggestions lately, and my presentation is being continually reshaped more than I would like. And there is a lot to research and a lot to exchange and learn with all of you. It's really a work in progress. So forget the pretentious title on the folder. A better title for the moment is just musical numbers of Brazilian chanchadas between 1940 and 1960. Okay, so in Brazil, the link between the cinema and other forms of popular entertainment led to the consolidation of a genre considered specifically Brazilian, chanchadas. The term refers to a body of films made between the mid-1930s and the beginning of the 1960s that used musical performances intertwined with comic situations with a thin narrative line and strong connection with the world of carnival. The term chanchada, as explained by Rafael Freire, was an adjective used to negatively describe poorly made films. Later, between the 40s and the 60s, the adjective chanchada has become a noun, and subsequently over the 70s and the 80s, it was released from the value judgment that accompanied it and started to be used in a more objective way by recent historians. In the 1980s, João Luiz Vieira imposed an important revaluation of chanchadas. In a recent article about these Brazilian musical comedies, he stresses the importance of the carnivalesque, arguing that, and I quote, as a moment of integration and collective catharsis, a profoundly social and interactive form of jouissance, Carnival offers a trans-individual taste of freedom, in which costumed revelers play out imaginary roles corresponding to their most utopian desire. End of quote. For him, the polyphonic and profoundly mestizo cultural expression crystallized in the carnivalesque forms is an apt instrument for the investigation of Brazilian cinema, especially in its musical forms, since it has always been impregnated by the cultural values associated with carnival. What is at stake is therefore the utopian hopes that in the musical numbers show up in the play with other media strategies. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, Brazilian studios in Rio de Janeiro tried to overtake foreign competition and create bonds with local public through the association with popular music and revue scenes or vaudeville scenes, trying at the same time model themselves on Hollywood production systems. Intermedia was the first Brazilian studio to follow. Ainda não precisa passar, é só ir para o slide. Isso. Intermedia was the first Brazilian studio to follow this logic on the 30s, relying on stars from radio and theater, developing a local star system and using imported equipment and skilled technicians. Their films relied on musical numbers executed by singers like Carmen Miranda, Francisco Alves, and vaudeville actors. With the inauguration of the Atlântida studios in 1941, films started to include stronger narrative connections between the musical numbers. In 1947, Atlântida came under control of the most powerful commercial exhibitor in Brazil, Luiz Severiano Ribeiro Jr., who strived to produce films with low cost and high connection with the public, ensuring big gains until the end of the 1950s. The musical performances of these chanchadas have a logic of its own that separates them both from the story that is being told inside the film and from the canonic Hollywood musicals. On the one hand, there is the usual rupture typical of musicals. These performances interrupt the fluidity of the narrative diegesis, which is replaced by a moment of self-reflexivity and confrontation of the viewer. On the other hand, there is a breach of the classic narrative standard, because the mise-en-scène relates both to cinema and to the routine of other cultural repertoires, which are in turn resulting from previous blends. Sometimes the topic and the singers that suddenly appear in musical performances do not have a direct relationship with the plots that are displayed on the screen or with the destiny of the characters. They are more connected with musical hits of that year or the radio or in records or with the songs that would be launched in Carnival of that year. The first example for discussion is a film by Luiz de Barros, made for Cinédia in 1944, Berlim na Batucada. This film is one of the few survivors from that period, as informed by Luciana Araújo, who researches Luiz de Barros. This director was involved since the 1910s with several types of shows and was, besides a film director, the playwright and director of vaudeville, set designer and costume designer in plays and casinos, besides cinema.
Esse é o Chico, sabe? Moro aqui no moro, isso é. Muito prazer, né? É pena que moro vai para baixo, não? Vai abaixo?
Is there any subtitles here? No, there is no subtitles. But that doesn't matter. The one in the middle is Sensual.
Acabar com Estácio, o velho. Estácio, derrubem todos os montes, derrubem meu barracão, silenciar a mangueira.
The acting is exaggerated, I don't know if you noticed, for naturalist standards, but perfectly adjusted to performances of review at that time. The presence of the other characters, also in the roles of the foreigner in search for Brazilian musicality, and the supporting malandros, they were there, is used to make a connection between different styles. They interact with the radio idol, Francisco Alves, who then sings his hit of the year. Part of the success of musical numbers was strictly related to the participation of review comedians, not singers, but comedians, and not only dancers or musicians. The choreographies performed by comedians like Dercy Gonçalves or Grande Otelo, who are in the next example, happen within the non-naturalist style of the vaudevillian reviews, many times inserted on a more diegetic stage. These are actors, comic actors, not dancers.
Right now the title is Brazilian musical films from 1930s and the intermediate vocation of the filmed musicians. In a dialogue with the basic premises of the project that takes intermediality as a historiographic method, my investigation will focus on the networking of some Brazilian musical films from the 1930s with popular music, radio, the record industry, and to a certain extent, the Hollywood film industry. This method that assumes cinema mixed nature and allows observing it as a combination of artistic forms and media has motivated the framework of this study in a specific approach. What the supporting musicians in the musical moments of some films may say about the networking of these different media. My aim is to promote a reflection that may address the films, taking their songs and musicians as a starting point and vice versa. At times unnoticed, these instrumentalists I will focus on, as well as the singers who were the main stars of these musical numbers, generally had in steady contracts with Brazilian radio broadcasters and record labels. To conceive of the interpretative dimensions that these musical moments potentiated, which include intermediate meetings and transnational dialogues,
there are numberless challenges, even more so when borders between local and foreign traditions overlap. My starting point was the film called Coisas Nossas, 1931, which was idealized by people associated with the record industry. The North American Wallace Downey who was at that time the artistic supervisor of Columbia Records in São Paulo, was responsible for the direction. Inspired by North American musical reviews, the film, which had not a specific plot, included many musical numbers and comic sketches, both with popular artists from the radio, popular theater, and the local record industry. No copies of this movie have been preserved. However, copies of its original Vitaphone discs were found in 1995 and partially recovered. I have researched the film's musical repertoire and its possible associations with the record industry in Brazil at that time, and the preliminary results have been published, partially published. One of the questions indicated was the dominance of sonorities and rhythms linked to the rural universe, although in the beginning of the 1930s, the Brazilian musical scene was varied and expanding, thanks to the appearance of radio and electronic recording techniques. On the other hand, the same media, along with talking pictures, have intensified the circulation of foreign musical pieces that quickly influenced some local musical arrangements. The strategy of privileging a repertoire that at that time sounded typically Brazilian was positive, since, in addition to the film's financial success, it probably helped to relativize the fact of a foreigner has been paramount in managing our things. At the core of Coisas Nossas, 70 artists, among the many actors and musicians who participated, were particularly highlighted, appearing within their faces within stars. One of them, Zezinho, immediately drew my attention. Firstly, he was not a famous revue actor. Secondly, he was also not a singer or conductor of a well-known orchestra. Finally, Zezinho is the diminutive of Zé, Joey, a nickname for José, one of the most common names in Portuguese language. In other words, it seemed to indicate that finding out to whom this face belonged, that was printed in the posters and ads promoting the film, was a great challenge. It was exactly intermediality as a method of historiographical research that offered a path, since Zezinho of Coisas Nossas was actually, in the late 1920s, a celebrity on the radio scene and in the local record industry, due to his multi-instrumentalist skills. In these films by Disney Studies, in addition to giving voice to the Brazilian part again, he appears playing a pencil or a small drumstick next to Aurora Miranda. Some sources indicate that his swing has inspired the cartoonists. However, the particularly interesting fact here is that in this film, his voice is literally detached from his body in its quirky but outstanding apparition, a voice that also has appeared in the mouth of a Disney parrot in many other languages. I will show you a little.
One of the things we were talking about yesterday in the project meeting that we had was how videographic criticism might be a very important thing for this particular project, both as a means of doing research and exploring ideas and as a means of sharing those with an audience and perhaps reaching an audience beyond a traditional academic audience. And so my presentation is really going to be around corralling some examples of different videographic criticism, some of which I've made myself or co-made, in one case with Douglas Pye, and in other cases picking out some different examples from what I'm sure you're all aware is a very diverse and excitingly diverse field, but some points of reference that might be interesting to us and might stimulate a few ideas. So the first thing I've pulled out, one of the ways in which videographic work is often quite successful, I think, is in juxtaposing different films, different film forms, different contexts. And again, that might speak to some of the kind of work that's going to be involved in this project as we move between different cinemas and think about the dialogue between Brazilian cinema and other cinemas, and perhaps particularly North American cinemas, but I'm sure, well, by no means exclusively. Albert's already been working on a video essay that looks at the relationship between Pasolini and Eisenstein and certain Brazilian films and filmmakers. So the first example is quite a famous one about neorealism by someone who stars her or himself as Kogonada. Do you know who Carl Kogonada is? I haven't managed to work it out yet either. Here it is as curated by Chris Keithley in the first edition of In Transition, which is the peer-reviewed journal of videographic film and media studies. We're just going to show you the opening of this because it illustrates that question of juxtaposition in an extremely direct way. And also that question of playfulness. Quite a lot of videographic work has a performative quality, and we were imagining yesterday how you might take the existing surviving soundtrack of a film for which the images no longer exist, and that one way of exploring that might be to do something imaginative in these terms. So here is What is Neorealism by Kogonada. We're going to watch a couple of minutes of this.
If I had to conduct an experiment that would yield insight into neorealism, I'd build a time machine and travel to Italy circa 1952. I'd ask Vittorio De Sica to make a film using Hollywood actors like Montgomery Clift and Jennifer Jones. I'd then team De Sica up with a Hollywood producer, the kind that liked to impose his will and sensibility onto a film, someone like David O. Selznick. In bringing these two worlds of cinema together, I'd hope for a clash in sensibilities so great that it would result in two cuts of the same film, one by De Sica and the other by Selznick. I would run these two films side by side and examine each cut, and in the difference, I would find something to say about the essence of neorealism. Both films start with a shot of a city, but Selznick not only tells you which city, but connects this city to the theme of love. Selznick's second shot shows a letter that spells out the central tension of the film. Meanwhile, De Sica's opening takes almost twice as long, but reveals far less. Already in the first few minutes, we can detect two distinct approaches to cinema. If we sync up some of the shots used in both versions, we can more clearly see the difference in approach. Selznick consistently prefers a shorter take than De Sica. For Selznick and most of Hollywood, the act of walking needs only to be implied, not endured. We can see this strategy at work in the following scene. De Sica shows Montgomery and Jennifer's entire walk through the restaurant, whereas Selznick implies this walk by jump-cutting through it. These in-between moments are what most movies seek to cut out, and yet it's these in-between moments that De Sica seems to be valuing. Syncing up another scene, we're able to see another value of De Sica, which Selznick sees as disposable, certainly contrary to Hollywood filmmaking. Note where Selznick cuts. This is a standard movie-making cut. In fact, most directors would have called cut on the set soon after Jennifer left the frame. De Sica, however, keeps rolling. He lingers on the space that the lead character has just left to stay on others who are still there or are about to enter the frame. This is a favorite move by De Sica. He does it throughout the film. His main characters leave a space, but his cameras don't follow, nor does he cut. He lingers on extras that we'll never get to know. For De Sica, these extras are fellow inhabitants, not extra, but vital, and therefore worthy of some time. By lingering, he decenters the primary characters. Selznick has cut almost every one of these lingering moments out. Lingering on those who add nothing to the story is considered excessive, or even worse, a distraction, derailing the plot or drawing attention away from the stars.
The information exchange between two or more different media have any value in itself? Surely this phenomenon has to bear consequences to our lives and to society in general in order to be worth studying. In an attempt to address this question, my focus today will be on those works which embrace cinema's intermedial nature with a political intent and to political ends. In what follows, and with the help of our intermedia colleagues and advisors, I propose to test the extent to which these works have transformative effects on the reality around us. I am certainly not the first to sense the gravitas of the real in the state of in-betweenness that characterizes cinema from its inception, and I expect Agnes Pethő to be enlightening us further on this matter in her keynote speech later today. Petho has, in fact, already warned us that the medium is not just a vehicle for meaning, but physical content itself. She says, theories of medium have called attention to the way in which it is never directly the meaning or the pure message that we perceive in a communication, but the material mediality of the signification which unavoidably shapes our construction of the meaning. Outside the intermedial sphere, critics like Slavoj Žižek have identified the kernel of the real in the virtual form of film, a subject dear, for example, to semioticians and linguists such as Roman Jakobson, who highlights as one of cinema's main properties the ability to combine sign and referent. He says, is there a contradiction between these two theses? Film operates by the object. Film operates by the sign. The contradiction between the two theses had already been discussed by St. Augustine. This brilliant 5th century thinker, who subtly distinguished the thing, res, from the sign, signum, shows that alongside the signs, whose essential function is to signify something, there are things that we can utilize with the function of sign. It is precisely this optical and acoustic thing, changed into sign, that constitutes the specific matter of cinema.
My name is Alison Butler. I'm from the University of Reading and I'm one of the co-investigators on the Reading team. My title, like some other people's, has changed since I wrote my abstract, so my talk is now called Artists' Film as Intermedial Form, Intermediality and Objecthood. And some people might recognise the subtitle as a sly reference to a notorious essay by Michael Fried, which I'm actually not going to talk about, but it indicates ways in which some of the ideas I'm going to discuss today could develop in the future. I should say that my examples today are shamelessly, or maybe shamefully, Anglophone. I'm going to talk about 2 English works and 1 North American work, because the Reading team are so early in their engagement with the project that some of us have not done a lot of Brazilian research yet. But maybe Brazilian colleagues can point me in the direction of Brazilian examples, and also help me think about whether the research questions in that context are similar or different. The starting point of my paper then is a throwaway remark made by the philosopher Jacques Rancière, if indeed he ever made such a thing as a throwaway remark, when visiting the department in 2014. He was asked about works of film and moving image in art galleries and museums, to which he responded by describing these as more or less unidentified objects. And this could have been quite a dismissive phrase, but I thought it was also a pretty interesting one. I began to think about whether artists' films and moving image installations might be unidentified objects because of their intermediality. Are they in fact intermedial objects? But the direction that this paper has taken me in is thinking that rather than being intermedial objects, these works, at least in the contemporary situation, rather than the 60s and 70s, might in fact be containers for intermedial objects, and that it might be more useful to think of them as containers. So, in his introduction to the edited collection Cinematographic Objects, Volker Pantenberg speculates on what might constitute a new object-oriented filmology. He proposes 3 basic categories of film objects: the objects used in filmmaking, the object of the film itself, and the objects in films.
My general remit in the project is to map the connections between visual arts, especially conceptual art, in the 1960s and 70s and beyond, with films from the same period, Cinema Novo, Cinema Marginal, and Tropicalia cinema. Clearly, as you can see, I'm not sticking to the abstract that I provided in any way, shape or form. I was very interested, and I still am, in the ontology of the photograph vis-a-vis the cinematic image and the way that the photograph can emerge in a way to disrupt film. And I've used that idea and that research to create a video essay about the use of the still frame in Brazilian cinema. And I might return to that at some point. But as I'm looking more so now at the visual arts, I thought it would be better to give you an idea of my current research. This is one of 2 ideas that I'm working on at the moment to do with light and colour and cinema, and the kind of parallel or uneven histories of neo-concrete art and film in Brazil from the 60s on to the 70s. The other idea that I'm working on is to think about the introduction, or the kind of slow introduction of Eastman colour into Brazilian film at the end of the decade, in films like Antonio das Montes, and to think about the use of colour in Brazilian cinema with respect to Oiticica's theory about colour time and the body of colour. So to look at this kind of different strands of thought about colour, or uses of colour, at the same time, to see where those overlapped or don't, as the case may be. So this work on Ligia Pape and Cinema Novo, between art and light, puts together the artworks of Ligia Pape, especially her woodcuts, with a certain aesthetic of overexposed lighting that emerged in Brazil towards the end of the 50s and in the early 60s. And my contention is that the concept of luz estourada, which is burst or exploded light, this kind of overexposed natural lighting that was commonly used in Cinema Novo films, has a link to gilogravura, the woodcut or the wood engraving. If not a very obvious one, I think it does emerge in some important cases, and especially with testimony of cinematographers and directors who have said as such.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all. As Lucia said, I'm Albert Elduque. I'm the other postdoctoral researcher in the project. In the project, I'm especially focused in the relations between cinema and music in Brazilian cinema. I'm focusing it from different perspectives. For instance, I'm working on the organization of the season on music, contemporary music films in Reading Film Theatre. But in this paper, I'm going to talk about Júlio Bressane, who is a very important filmmaker to talk about music and film. Well, it's a paper that comes from my initial research and initial exploration, so I'm not an expert on Bressane, just some first impressions on some images and ideas that I found. Among the numerous Brazilian filmmakers that have explored the frontiers and the limits of the different arts, Júlio Bressane is probably the most relevant one. At least he is the one who has developed a longer career where this question appears once and again and formulated in relation to different arts. Be it in his beginnings in the cinema novo, in his films done in the context of the cinema marginal, or in his work from the 1980s onwards, he has developed a strong dialogue between different Brazilian cultures, different Brazilian cultural forms that goes beyond movements and classifications. Bressane is a key filmmaker to think about intermediality in Brazilian cinema. I think I will be risky and I will say that he's the filmmaker to think about intermediality. Not only his films combine all sorts of references to Brazilian culture, but his theoretical text seems to ask for an intermedial approach to his cinema. And even these texts could be considered intermedial manifestos. His book Alguns, which contains different essays on Brazilian music, poetry, literature, and cinema, is absolutely illuminating. In them, for example, a flute solo in a samba is described as a painting, and the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, the novel by Machado de Assis, is analyzed in its relations with painting, music, dancing, handwriting, bodies, charades, and cinema.
To sit at the table there. The format that we are thinking of organizing this is inviting each of you to summarize your ideas from all the papers delivered today in 5 to 10 minutes.
It seems that one of the most popular ideas that I'm always quoted on is this difference between structural and sensual type of intermediality. My observation is that regarding the state of the art of the researches on intermediality, this also works on a meta level, so to speak. So there's a structural approach to questions of intermediality, and there's a sensual approach on researches on intermediality, and there's the need that I strongly advocate to combine the two and to get beyond the limitations of each. So there's the structural approach where theory strives to be as abstract as possible, as philosophical as possible, to produce categories which are infallible, which really capture the essence of things. And there's this trend of theorists regarding intermediality, a very strong strand that originates from semiotics, of course, that does these researches. And then there's this other type which starts empirically from film analysis, from an acrostic description of films, because the best film theory and the best film analysis, the best videographic analysis is an ekphrasis, in my opinion, that can describe in another language an artwork, so a kind of artwork in its own right. And so I think that there are two ways of combining these approaches in a very healthy and productive way. So not to go into the extreme of theorizing very abstractly and to the extreme of just describing very sensuously what we see in the films. And these two ways I see, first is this historiographic approach. So you view things in their historical context, connected to certain very palpable, excavatable. So you go to the archives and you collect these data, and then you rely on them, and abstract categories as well. And then the other one is the poetics of intermediality, and or combined very strongly, as Lucia always suggests, to politics of intermediality, not to be confused with an ideology of intermediality. So this poetics, politics, and historiographical approach seems to me very productive, and this whole research group and all the results that you have shown so far seems very, very promising and very reassuring for me that this is something that could lead to valuable research output, so to speak. And I don't want to speak too long. I just wanted to reiterate this main idea of mine with two very simple categories used in natural sciences. This approach called in Latin in vitro and in vivo. So you study something in vitro means you study it in a laboratory. You take it out of context and you bring your scientific apparatus, your microscope and whatnot, and you analyze it, taken out of context, like a tissue in a biological laboratory. And then the other method of in vivo, so meaning you don't tear it out of its context, but you study the phenomenon in its real life context. So intermediality understood in this way that I suggested, and intermediality that you proposed in your researches here with this study of these forms of the combination, early forms of the combination of theater and popular culture and television, movies, performance. Actually, early cinema is the best paradigm for this approach to intermediality, because it reminds us that films don't mean this object to reflect on another presentation. It is always embedded in a live experience at all points of its production and reception. And it can be seen at the beginning of the cinema and at the end of cinema, so to speak, because it can be seen in these installations and post-cinematic works that recontextualize moving image into an installation space, into a performance space that engages space and live action in a different way. And it can be seen in early cinema. But it's a viewpoint that should not be missed in other forms either. So I think your researches that begin with the early forms are very, very valuable. And also these early forms of intermediality and intermedial performance connected to cinema are the ones that can that always connect to local culture.
What I thought was wonderful was the scope of this project that was clearly on display. during this workshop today, looking back from early cinema or post-cinema attractions, cinema of attractions perhaps that we could say, of Luciana's presentation, to 1990s and more recent musical documentaries and the cinema nova of 1960s. Intermediality provides us with a framework to bring together these different historical moments in Brazilian cinema and look at it in certain angles that have not been done before, I would say. And I think I had the privilege of seeing this project grow from a fruit of an idea to what it is already shaping to be something of unique and important contribution right now. So I'm looking forward to how the project progresses. One not problem, but conflict I continuously encountered when studying my own research, researching my own project on Intermedia for 1960s Japan, and applying this methodological framework of Intermedia onto it, was two things. One, intermediality potentially provides us with limitless possibilities of investigations. It seems really endless. We could continuously study all these different art forms and how they relate to cinema in both moments, but also cinema more broadly. And this is exciting, but it does have this anything and all problem. I'm not saying that I've seen this presented today, but it's something that I continuously encountered. And Agnes has talked about this in terms of the inflation of the terminology, intermedia, even within Europe, and also even within Europe, it's continuously changed. The terminology has been subject to change, and depending on who is speaking when about intermedia. Also historically, what's being discussed as intermedia in the 1960s is very different to the theoretical academic context in which is being applied today, since perhaps the 90s onwards. And I think it's, in light of all these differences, I'm not saying it's a problem. In fact, I feel like it's something to celebrate, that it encourages and allows for these different interpretations. But I think these different interpretations do call for a specificity, or each project to attempt at least a specificity of the term. And perhaps this is what I at least attempted to do with Japan, to discuss how intermedia was specifically discussed in Japan in the 1960s, who said these things when, how it was discussed and debated, and that opened for me a way of looking at these expanded form of film performances in Japan, as well as resonating with more contemporary frameworks of intermedia. So I was really excited, especially in Albert's presentation, to hear this terms like transcreation, and I look forward to hearing more about how this term has come about and has been discussed and debated, and whether that will allow for a specificity in terms of Brazilian art and cinema, and how these forms of intermedia could have been discussed. Perhaps intermedia as a term itself was not used or imported in any way, but maybe there are other resonating terminologies that had a similar effect in terms of discussion and practice. And I look forward to hearing more about those geographic specificities, because as I think it was, one second. I think it was Lisa who mentioned applying this Eurocentric framework of intermediality does have problems and limitations, and I feel perhaps this looking into the transcreation, for example, or specific terms that was discussed within Brazil, in dialogue with what's going on outside of Brazil, perhaps would open up new ways of looking at the Brazilian cinema. So I'm excited excited for those investigations, and look forward to hearing more about it.
Okay.
just a few methodological challenges. You'll know them better than I do, but just things that came to my mind. I was very grasped by the idea of politics, and perhaps I'll focus a little bit on that. Thinking about the effects, and I was thinking maybe about another form of intermediality that you didn't discuss, might be journalism, debate, social debate. So thinking specifically about Lucia's idea of real effects in the world. And I was thinking about a film that I just teach, just a week at Portsmouth, Entre les Murs, The Class. It was a film of French students in a classroom. And one thing we look at is, how did this actually affect debates in France about multiculturalism in France? So I thought it would be interesting to as one of the intermediate things you're looking at would be journalism. That I don't think people mentioned specifically, a little bit, but that might be something quite interesting. My own work at the moment is focusing on film funding bodies, particularly European funding bodies, and their relationship to world cinema. So the Hubert Valls Fund, the World Cinema Fund, some of the French film funders. And one thing I was thinking when I was listening to your work as well is that there might have been more, perhaps, this isn't a criticism at all, I'm just trying to bring what I can bring to you, on production context in terms of the funders, because, for example, I know some of the funders in Europe don't allow films to be filmed in different countries. That doesn't fit their criteria. So I'm wondering if you look at a funder, they might have certain notions of what allowed in terms of intermediality. They might be a funding body that funds documentaries, so they might reject certain forms of intermediality. Having said that, they might accept other forms of intermediality. So it might be interesting to look at what conditions the funders place on the filmmakers. Not talking about censorship here, but talking about, conditions of production and what's, you might have a funder saying, this is an art film, I don't want a song, take the song, whereas others might be. So I think that's important. If it's a commercial film, they might say, actually, we want more song and dance. So just to kind of look at the niche market that the film is destined for when you're looking at notions of intermediality might be interesting. I think one of the dangers of a project like this is that it can become very, very detailed and very list-like. So you might be identifying forms of intermediality that are fascinating, but then perhaps you need to document these. I'm sure you'll do this, as these were early stages, and a lot of you did do it, but the sense of why. Why is this important? Why do we need to know that film and music and photography were together? How did one form affect the history of the other form? How did it affect viewing practices? So just taking it to the next level and asking the kind of, so why is this important? I thought the paper on the guy who's always in the background was fascinating. Why is that important? How did that affect Hollywood's view of Brazilians or not? Or how did it affect his status in Brazil? Or is he reduced to just another invisible Latino? So the kind of the next level of the, so why does this matter? Why is it important? Because clearly it does matter. I think, and a lot of you did do that.
So the title is Understanding Intermediality in Contemporary Cinema, Changing Shapes of In-Betweenness. And what I'm trying to speak about first is post-media figurations of intermediality. When we speak of understanding intermediality, first and foremost, we must always be aware that this involves two interconnected aspects. The general intermediality of film, that is the ontological in-betweenness of film as a technology-bound audiovisual medium tied to other cultural forms of communication, and the intermediality in film, that is the figurations of in-betweenness, the productive ways in which film draws on intermedia and inter-art entanglements. The idea of in-betweenness acquired a rich significance within both of these aspects, and the intermediality of film as a medium always determines the strategies of intermediality that occur, and needs to be addressed as something in constant change and cross-pollination within the general media landscape of an age. But what happens when it is exactly this in-betweenness that is most challenged by the media convergences and fusions occurring in the so-called post-media age? While the intermedial strategies of modernist cinema brought together the different arts and media in self-reflexive situations of dialogue and confrontation, and employed in many ways the tensions created by introducing the form of one medium into the other, producing, in the words of Raymond Bellour, a kind of aesthetic vertigo. Today we see the explosion of the cinematic medium itself through the diverse technologies of image production. Consequently, in the so-called post-media age, we have a whole new area of intermediate relations occurring between traditional cinema and other forms of moving images. And we see the necessity of a reconceptualization of the idea of in-betweenness, shaped by the affordances of new technologies. On the other hand, however, digital imagery absorbs photography, painting, and moving images, morphing one into the other seamlessly through their shared technologies. So while we have recently become extremely sensitive to diversity among various types of moving images, it may appear that differences between film and the other visual media tend to be less and less relevant to us, each becoming a mere phase in the practice of digital image processing. The photographic, the cinematic, or the painterly are no longer attributes of distinct arts connected to specific materialities, but have become experiences reaching beyond the traditional boundaries of media, sensations perceived in all kinds of images and art forms that surround us. From the perspective of intermediality, today's media landscape is therefore a perpetually shifting terrain, where the rise of new forms is counterbalanced by the endless process of hybridizations, remediations, erasures of differences, and the so-called free flow of media contents on digital platforms that also constantly brings together art and commodification. Understanding intermediality and contemporary cinema requires the exploration of this shifting terrain and the identification of figurations of in-betweenness to which we can attribute a performative quality, keeping in mind the fact that we should always consider the prefix inter indicative of a productive relationship that actively performs something. The typical figurations for the age of digital convergence are usually identified as multimedia collages, mashups we access on the internet, or the morphing effects of CGI we see in blockbuster movies, video clips, or video installations. Nevertheless, and here is the place where I will probably disappoint you, I will leave all these figurations aside, as they have recently received a lot of attention in media studies. Instead, I propose an incursion into a less ostentatious terrain and focus on a particular type of feature films which operate with less hybrid but still extremely saturated images, exhibiting a media compactness typical for the digital age, yet capable of conveying sensations of media ambivalence that may trigger a meaningful clash of cultural and inter-art associations. One of the most relevant areas where post-mediality meets intermediality in such an understated yet palpable and productive way is the revitalization of the classical cinematic tableau shot, a static shot framed like an autonomous picture, along with the figuration of the tableau vivant proper, that is the reproduction, a paraphrase of a painting as a real-life pro-filmic scene, and the blurring of the boundaries between them. I have recently published several articles in which I try to unravel different aspects of this figuration. So the viewpoints that I'm presenting here will hopefully add new arguments to my interpretation of the tableau as an intermedial image characteristic for the globalized post-media age. Now the gesture of constructing the single image as if it were a photograph or a painting, implying a self-contained world, is essential to the tableau, which often creates a vision of totality within its own frame. And accordingly, in opposition to modernist strategies emphasizing painting or photograph-like deframings, as well as still compositions as a deliberate fragmentation of the perception of the world, in contemporary art cinema, the prolonged tableau sequences that seamlessly merge sensations of photography, film, and painting often become means for contemplating interconnectedness and totality. So-called slow movies, which prominently feature such images, for example, often address major themes related to history, humanity, the dynamics of a particular way of life, etc. The films of Pedro Costa, Bela Tar, or Lav Diaz, just to name a few directors, all unfold cinematic worlds of epic proportions based on such an aesthetic. However, my aim in this presentation is not to address the polyvalence of slowness, but to trace slightly more extreme forms of in-betweenness, manifest in conflicting acts of connection to and disconnection from a historically localizable pro-filmic reality, in a rigorous control over detail and adherence to structure, only to be seriously undermined by themes of violence, vulnerability, and transience. I will focus on instances in which the tableau style foregrounds and magnifies this elemental gesture of encompassing a world within a single image, either through complexity or sheer size, only to frame this world in between stability and instability, capturing it in situations of extreme crisis, threatening it with destruction. What I'm looking for is cases in which there is an impression of media fusion prominent in powerfully effective quasi-autonomous images, yet this condensed form unravels into a series of sensations and associations perceptible in a tensional field of in-betweenness, between reality and artificiality, flatness and plasticity, abstraction and raw corporeality, art house cinema and popular culture, and so on. Moreover, the examples that follow have themselves been gleaned from films situated in the in-betweenness of the periphery of world cinema and the center of the relative visibility within the international festival circuit and art house cinema. All of these films also perform a movement from particular to universal through an emphasis on pictorial stylization, and employ the framework of eschatological narratives that ultimately wrap up their manifold plays of in-betweenness in the overarching theme of human existence, life, and death. I will begin with an example that is symptomatic for the process of creating such highly saturated images. Then I will proceed to present two directions in which the tableau construction can be modulated. A, towards a pronounced photo-pictorial aestheticism, and B, towards a photo-sculptural corporealization of the image. Now, I will show you, under this puzzling title, a 2-minute short film, which was created for a festival organized with the keywords fashion and alchemy by 2 students of the Hungarian Film Academy in 2012 with the title Homunculus. Not because this would be a masterpiece, so I'm showing this because I see this as highly symptomatic. So let's watch the clip. It's the whole thing. An entity by way of an alchemy of images, blending together different sensations, forms of art that we see here, sums up in fact the process of creating a typical post-media tableau. The film opens with images suggestive of the biological conception of life, followed by images juxtaposing installation and concept art, fashion design and photography, cinema and the plastic arts, culminating in a tableau vivant that concludes the trajectory of life drawn in the film with a single image that unites life and death, an exhibit objectifying live bodies in the well-known pose of the Pietà. The image emerges as the magnum opus, as an intermedial homunculus created through the media and interart alchemy performed in the film. But what is this image? Is this life being transfigured into a picture, an image confronting the mortality of the body with the immortality of art? Or is it the transmutation of the abstract form of the alchemical symbolism of the triangle into the triangle of the bodies in Pietà as a trinity of film, painting / sculpture and performance art? We may note at this point that the man facing the image of the inception of life is János Derzsi, whose statuesque carved features have been engraved in our memory through the cinema of Béla Tarr, if you're familiar with his films. Most importantly, the short film pays homage to the Turin horse made just a year before, in which János Derzsi embodied a man facing the end of the world, and who was also presented in the posture of Mantegna's and Holbein's famous depictions of the dead Christ, while Tar's moving images themselves became more and more stilled and alloyed with photography before completely fading to black. However, this connection to Tar and the sensation of familiarity with his favorite actor is not exclusive. The image pulls strongly in the direction of more universal and non-localizable associations. The pose itself also opens up a multitude of associations as the compositional components identify it as a depiction of Pietà, but it is not a proper tableau vivant reproduction of a single painting or a sculpture. We cannot help but acknowledge that the composition appears familiar to us, not only from books or museums, but because of the countless repetitions of the pose that are available to us through the internet. Thus, we may find interpretations of Pietà in videos like Sam Taylor Wood's 2001 crossover between installation and performance art, in which she struggles to hold the muscular body of Robert Downey Jr., or we may browse through all the variations offered by Marina Abramovic alongside permutations in painting, photography, comics, even advertising. The many paraphrases of the Pietà available to us in digital form may be positioned in between the so-called meta-images, laden with signification, subordinated to a self-reflexive authorial gesture referencing another artwork, and the anonymous memes characteristic of the digital age, which require not a decoding but a constant recoding by attaching new meanings to the same picture over and over again. On the other hand, the process of alchemy depicted in the film and interpreted as a metaphor for post-mediality may also recall to a certain extent the idea of post-cinematic metallurgy derived from Deleuze and Guattari and elaborated by Patricia Pistos. According to Pistos, filmmakers turn to the audiovisual archives to dig up and reassemble materials in the process that has, I quote, a performative effect in reshaping our collective memory. However, in her vision, the aim of such strategies of metallurgy is to point, I quote, to radical contingencies of history. What I would like to emphasize here is another type of complex metallurgic strategy of intermediality in contemporary cinema. The forging of these quasi-autonomous mega-images of emblem-like density, which pull the fictional world away from historical references through the opaque amalgamation of art references and or universal symbolism, as well as through a mimetic recoding of well-known visual schemes across a variety of media. At the same time, as we have seen in this short film, all the other images gravitate towards this loosely attached tableau vivant that has the ability not only to connect in a hypermimetic logic towards a virtually infinite number of variations, but also to provide a powerful anchor for the interpretation of the film, aggregating different levels of significations. Moreover, such performative images excavating the legacy of grand images of fine art may exert their magnetism over feature-length fiction films, even without being part of the narrative diegesis. We see this in the prologue of Lars von Trier's Melancholia, which features an elaborate digital tableau vivant sequence combining the artifice of fashion photography and surrealist painting. Or we may see the same effect in some of the images designed for the ads and DVD covers that circulate in different forms alongside the films effectively redefining the traditional paratextual role of the movie poster. Kim Ki-duk's Pietà is perhaps the most striking example of this kind, where the gripping tableau on the cover art appears as the central image for the scene, for the film, that steers the layers of interpretation even without being actually in the film, hovering enigmatically over the brutal story of revenge and sacrifice. The wide-scale deployment of such emblem-like pictures in contemporary cinema or new media actually converges with our more general media consumption practices, which hinge on the allure of so-called iconic images crossing different media forms and platforms. Now, beside the process of forging the tableau as an intermedial mega image, which is a potential inherent to the tableau mode, the idea of associating biological and artificial or artistic creation in homunculus resonates with a whole range of other strategies that condense life and art in a disconcerting way within the tableau style. This duality is at the core of my next examples, in which highly aestheticized tableau are combined with narratives staging a clash between elemental biological existence and powerful forces of society that threaten this existence with imminent destruction. It is an opposition that connects, of course, to the idea of the Foucauldian biopolitics, and that is unpacked by Agamben in the fundamental categories of bare life versus political existence. Now I'm going to talk to you under this heading of Pretty as a Picture, Bare Life, and the Photofilmic Aestheticism of the tableau. Two films, Abderrahmanes Sissako's Timbuktu and Alexander Kotz's Test. They were both made in 2014, and both present an unsettling mixture of realism and artificiality within loosely knit narrative structures. Both unfold in extremely picturesque landscape shots and domestic tableau, and have as their main protagonist simple people whose lives are suddenly and violently destroyed. In the French-Mauritanian film set in 2012 and inspired by real events, Timbuktu, the legendary city, is under the occupation of radical Islamists who impose a cruel and absurd rule banning music and football, stoning a young unmarried couple to death, and so on. You might be familiar with this film. I'm presuming that this is the film you know from my examples. So the main protagonists are a cattle herdsman, his wife and daughter, who live in a tent among the sand dunes outside the city, and do not flee, believing that they will somehow escape the danger posed by the jihadists. In the end, however, both he and his wife are shot to death. Now, in the other film, in the fable-like Russian film, the time is August 1959, when Russia performed its first hydrogen bomb test in a remote, supposedly uninhabited region somewhere in Kazakhstan. Now, this spot, however, excluded from the political map of the Soviet Union, is home to a father and teenage daughter living in harmony with nature, tending to their sheep. There is even a tender love triangle between the daughter and two young prospective suitors from the nearby small settlement. But it all comes to an astonishing end with the nuclear explosion appearing as something like an eruption of the sun, and that sweeps them away in one magnificent breath. Now, in both films, the solid constructedness of the pictorial organization of the frames and the idyllic world appearing in the tableau in stark contrast with the depiction of the forces that destabilize and demolish the world of the protagonist. So we see this stark contrast between the beauty of the images and the actual content of the narrative. Foregoing a comprehensive analysis of the films, I would like to emphasize the way in which this incongruity becomes productive in redrawing the schema of melodrama and the intermediality of the images. According to András Bálint Kovács, melodrama, I quote, is basically fatalistic. It presents the passive emotional experience of an innocent victim who has to face the antagonistic forces that prove to be overwhelming. In classical melodrama, this unsurmountable power can be either social, emotional, or physical in nature. In modernist melodrama, however, it is not the presence, but the absence of something that always proves emotionally debilitating. In both Timbuktu and Test, the protagonists appear in situations they have absolutely no control over, where their bare existence is threatened by brutal forces, even if these are unusually portrayed. The jihadists appear somewhat childish or even humanely flawed in Timbuktu, while destruction is both majestic as well as unexpected in the doomsday vision of Test. The two films thus seem to position themselves in between classical and modernist melodramas in retaining the palpable imbalance of powers, but also removing from the visible frame the real antagonist in the equation. The immense cruelty and the absurdity of the destruction appears incomprehensible, yet just as overwhelming as the beauty of the world, which appears sensuously within reach in each frame, which also reminds us of our failures to live up to it, of course. The emphasis on the all-pervasive asceticism on the images provides not just a puzzling contrast or backdrop for the narrative, but engages a poetics of intermediality that excavates the powers of the photofilmic image in contemporary cinema. This is, however, an unsettling pictoriality. Visual archives to dig up and reassemble materials in the process that has, I quote, a performative effect in reshaping our collective memory. However, in her vision, the aim of such strategies of metallurgy is to point, I quote, to radical contingencies of history. What I would like to emphasize here is another type of complex metallurgic strategy of intermediality in contemporary cinema. The forging of these quasi-autonomous mega-images of emblem-like density, which pull the fictional world away from historical references through the opaque amalgamation of art references and or universal symbolism, as well as through a mimetic recoding of well-known visual schemes across a variety of media. At the same time, as we have seen in this short film, all the other images gravitate towards this loosely attached tableau vivant that has the ability not only to connect in a hypermimetic logic towards a virtually infinite number of variations, but also to provide a powerful anchor for the interpretation of the film, aggregating different levels of significations. Moreover, such performative images, excavating the legacy of grand images of fine art, may exert their magnetism over feature-length fiction films, even without being part of the narrative diegesis. We see this in the prologue of Lars von Trier's Melancholia, which features an elaborate digital tableau vivant sequence combining the artifice of fashion photography and surrealist painting. Or we may see the same effect in some of the images designed for the ads and DVD covers that circulate in different forms alongside the films, effectively redefining the traditional paratextual role of the movie poster. Kim Ki-duk's Petho is perhaps the most striking example of this kind, where the gripping tableau on the cover art appears as the central image for the scene, for the film, that steers the layers of interpretation even without being actually in the film, hovering enigmatically over the brutal story of revenge and sacrifice. The wide-scale deployment of such emblem-like pictures in contemporary cinema or new media actually converges with our more general media consumption practices, which hinge on the allure of so-called iconic images crossing different media forms and platforms. Now, beside the process of forging the tableau as an intermedial mega-image, which is a potential inherent to the tableau mode, the idea of associating biological and artificial or artistic creation in homunculus resonates with a whole range of other strategies that condense life and art in a disconcerting way within the tableau style. This duality is at the core of my next examples, in which highly aestheticized tableaux are combined with narratives staging a clash between elemental biological existence and powerful forces of society that threaten this existence with imminent destruction. It is an opposition that connects, of course, to the idea of the Foucauldian biopolitics, and that is unpacked by Agamben in the fundamental categories of bare life versus political existence. Now I'm going to talk to you under this heading of Pretty as a Picture, Bare Life, and the Photofilmic Aestheticism of the tableau, of two films, Abderrahmane Sissako's Timbuktu and Alexander Kotz's Test. They were both made in 2014, and both present an unsettling mixture of realism and artificiality within loosely knit narrative structures. Both unfold in extremely picturesque landscape shots and domestic tableaux, and have as their main protagonist simple people whose lives are suddenly and violently destroyed. In the French-Mauritanian film set in 2012 and inspired by real events, Timbuktu, the legendary city, is under the occupation of radical Islamists who impose a cruel and absurd rule banning music and football, stoning a young unmarried couple to death, and so on. It provides not just a puzzling contrast or backdrop for the narrative, but engages a poetics of intermediality that excavates the powers of the photofilmic image in contemporary cinema. This is, however, an unsettling pictoriality, introducing a play with patterns and forms that may be even categorized as pretty, shaping images into, I quote, poster-like tableaux vivants, a style treated with utter disdain by Krakauer, as Rosalind Krolt reminds us in her book entitled Pretty, Film and the Decorative Image. Moreover, both films support Gould's claim for pretty to be regarded as a feminized image that may deploy a metaleptic figuration in focusing on pretty-faced young girls as protagonists. Gould's book is relevant at the same time as it emphasizes the ambivalence of the pretty image, the fact that prettiness can offer its own politics. By mapping out a world that is rich in sensuous details, full of colorful textures, ornaments, everyday objects, images may offer an anthropologic density in an appeal to global attention. As such, they may appear as a critical strand of art cinema that addresses socio-political, or in this case, biopolitical issues in a transcultural form that counters the Eurocentric rejection of the Oriental and decorative. We may notice how some of the attractive tableau compositions in Timbuktu seem to articulate a dialogue with the traditional group compositions that have become a staple for Orientalism in painting. I've not included pictures. You all remember paintings by Delacroix, for example. What I would like to highlight, using the example of these films, is the performativity of this type of aestheticism in globalized post-cinema that is achieved through photographic pictorialism, combining what Stephen Jacobs names photoresque, a photographic rendering of the picturesque, and what I consider photofilmic, based on the term coined by Alexander Streitberger and Hilda van Gelder. Instances in which a sensation of the photographic is inscribed within the cinematic in the film. Now, both films look like a picture book of moving photographs with shocking content rendered in the glossy style we know from WordPress or Sony World Photography competitions. Notice this image from Timbuktu. If you saw the film, you remember this is a scene of a murder, of an accidental killing of the fisherman there. But it is an extraordinarily attractive image. It could win a photographic competition, this frame enlargement. So it is perhaps no surprise to find out, for example, that the director of Test, a Russian film, Alexander Kot, is also a photographer who imposed his photographic vision over his film, also by making the film absolutely speechless. Now, what the photographic brings to the cinematic in this case is not the emphasis on indexical relation of the profilmic reality, but a certain disconnect through the conspicuous mediation of the high-definition photographic image, which always means the connection between the eye, the lens, the hand, the photographic gesture of molding the visible into a picture, which is also a gesture of wrapping up a whole universe within one frame. Now, this gesture is reinforced in text by motifs like the collage or the world map on the wall that we will see later on in one of the clips. Now, I will show you a short clip from Test in which you can observe the working of this photofilmic, how it can subvert the romantic tradition of the pastoral through a playful use of photographic framing and deframing. So something happens as a photograph, as a moving photographs, but also in the montage of the different viewpoints. There's a play between photography and film. Okay, and now I will show you one more clip from the same film before I continue, a bit longer. intertwining of film and photography. Very nice little sequence. Okay, I'll cut it short and let's move on. And like this ghost-like photographic image projected and distorted over the texture of the decaying wall reminds us of photography's inherent connection to death, of course, and pinpointed by the likes of Bazin and Barthes as the essential link between photography and film. But in the movie it also foreshadows the end, the actual demise of the protagonists, by possibly reminding us of the shadows of people seared onto the walls by the explosion of the atomic bomb. This clip also shows us how the photo filmic may not only emphasize the common ontology of the two medium, or impose the qualities of the photographic single frame over the cinematic sequence, but it may be reflexively thematized as the intertwining of technologies as a biopower that has irreversibly transformed our life world viewed in terms of a garden, and that appears as an extension of the body and mind related to affect and emotion. The photofilmic camera means in test, of course, a means for courtship, for affection, and in Timbuktu it is a powerful weapon in the hands of the jihadis, who also compose a powerful still frame along with the video. So last but not least, the contrast, in contrast to a typically modernist strategy where the photographic overrides the cinematic by imposing its own logic, a process that Garrett Stewart famously coined as the photosynthesis of modernist cinema, I would like to stress the need to focus our attention on both components of the photofilmic at all times. In this respect, the photofilmic duality in post-media cinema recalls Bruno Latour's concept of iconophilia that stresses the meshing of stasis and movement in contrast with idolatry, which favors an immovable image. I quote, "The iconoclast dreams of an unmediated access to the truth, of a complete absence of images." He says, and I quote, "Iconophilia is respect not for the image itself, but for the movement of the image. It is what teaches us that there is nothing to see when we focus on the visual itself, instead the movement, the passage, the transition from one image form to another." Unquote. The performativity of the photofilmic image is always predicated on the movement of the in-betweenness, taking the form of superimpositions, reframing, collage, and often, like we saw here, through the meshing of the stasis of the photograph with a sensuous experience of tracing the movement of a single element in the frame as the rush of vitality and intensity, thus unfolding the literal meaning of the tableau vivant. So it doesn't have to be a collage, it doesn't have to be something like a morphing of a movement into a stillness or vice versa. It can be this rush, a single element of movement introduced in the picture, giving meaning to the tableau vivant. Now let me show you one more example of a highly effective photofilmic tableau vivant that is even further enhanced by the enfoldment within a narrative cinematic sequence. In Timbuktu, there is a scene in which we see one of the jihadist leaders being attracted to the wife of the protagonist. He approaches the woman and her daughter when the husband is away, and she is washing her hair. He demands that she covers her head. The woman defies him, and he leaves slightly embarrassed, like a schoolboy who doesn't know how to deal with his emotions. Now this is what happens next. And if you saw the film, you know what happens. If not, let's see. Sorry.
Stop. ستيمة لمرة جميلة قوية ودافعة. رجلها الراغب مرتاح. وكيف تعرف انت اللي يشكون مليح ولا اللي يشكون مش مليح؟ هو المليح المؤمن. نعرف انهم مؤمنين وهذا يكفي. عمار والله ما تعرفش تكلم العربية والله. ويجي سهل. نجي بلطة مشاكل انجليزي.
Okay, so we saw that as they ride in a jeep, they come up to a configuration of hills in the desert that resembles the pubic mound of a woman. Frustrated, the jihadist takes out his gun and mows down the tuft of grass popping up between the two sand dunes. Now the image harks back to an old tradition in painting, of course, the anthropomorphization of the landscape that reveals an underlying animist metamorphic thought that considers nature as a unitary living organism and superimposes here the female anatomy over the geomorphic shape, thus transforming the abstract generic image of the body, of the female body, into a unique and effective photofilmic body framed in the tableau. It also playfully transposes and reverses the fashionable trope of the photographic bodyscape into film, displaying an explosive intensity within a single frame unraveled in the moving sequence. A similar yet more straightforward transfer takes place in the first images of the film, in which the gunmen are shooting at wooden and clay sculptures in the desert. The scene in which again destruction is symbolically aimed both at the human body and at the body of a specific culture recalls with some irony the famous essay film of Chris Marker and Alain René, The Statues Also Die, which condemned the removal of African artworks from their natural cultural context and looks like the staging of a cruel art performance here. It also offers me as a stepping stone towards the final chapter in this presentation about the effective performative value of statues and a possible merger of sculpture and the photofilmic. So the last chapter here, bodies of statues and bodies as statues. And here I come to Lúcia Nagib's superb lecture delivered at our conference on the real and intermedial, which concluded with the idea that the giant skeleton of the whale in Andrei Zyagintsev's Leviathan signals with its massive frame the materiality of death. Towering over the small human figure, it suggests a disproportionate relationship between a sublime natural form and the destructive power of man. The figure of the skeleton as the palpable dead body of nature, overloaded with cultural associations, speaks to me in the context of my presentation also as a highly condensed mega-image that towers over the film, both in cyberspace, through the posters and publicity stills, and within the actual film experience. The skeleton itself, a sculpture designed and built for the film, ended up as a piece of commodity. According to newspaper reports, it was bought by a businessman and placed on the lawn outside of his house in Moscow. Now, this piece of entertainment news is significant, especially if we watch Alexei German Jr.'s film made a year later, which was inspired by the new generations of Russians for whom this would be an everyday gesture. In Under Electric Clouds, a film made in 2015, we see a kind of post-apocalyptic vision of Moscow set in 2017, 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, in which a skeleton-like frame of an unfinished skyscraper here on the left side of the image looms in the distance over an urban wasteland. Now, the eternally overcast sky displays advertisements that float and disperse on the horizon. Underneath, colorful lights weave decorative patterns in a city appearing as a cluster of images. The film parades a host of characters whose lives are loosely interconnected through acts of suicide, violence, the experience of frustration, grief, and senselessness. These are confusing times, the narrator informs us. Crucified, I'm quoting from the narrator's words, crucified between a great past and an equally large future, everyone seems to be waiting for a great war. Globalization failed to unify the world, unquote. German borrows the structure and several motifs from the great tradition of Russian 19th century literature. Most notably, it revisits the theme of the superfluous man. Neither of the characters are fleshed out, but we may find the gloomy pictoriality of the tableau entrancing. In this respect, the film can also be seen in parallel with, or as a remake of Alexander Sokurov's Whispering Pages, the third film in his so-called trilogy of Death and Nothingness, also based, as its subtitle indicates, on motifs from 19th century prose, and which shows his characters in a slow perambulation within a fog-infused dreamscape that appears in images like damaged, colorized photographs. Now, concluding his film, Sokurov, with an uncanny intimacy between the protagonist and an enigmatic giant sculpture, Sokurov unfolds his haunting vision in a completely artificial world as a cinematic ekphrasis of a few pages that one may vaguely remember from Russian literature, enhanced by his own poetic imagination. In contrast, German's stylized vision is ultimately anchored in the all-pervading aestheticization of contemporary life that Frederick Jameson described as, I quote, an addiction halfway between drugs and pornography and the mania of the pathological collector, unquote. His landscape includes a foggy riverbank littered with sculptures, some unfinished, some already crumbling or just outmoded, like the unavoidable statue of Lenin with his arms stretched pointing to nowhere, a mass of stone in an adult playground, a surface for graffiti. These statues appear symptomatic for our age, in which we live in spaces where not only are nature and culture irreversibly enmeshed, but art can reappropriate everything. The protagonists are hanging out in art galleries and exhibitions, partying among artworks in an environment in which a construction site, a junkyard, or an installation space become undistinguishable. These nomadic sculptures, to use Rosalind Krauss's famous expression for the expanded field of sculpture that populate the film, actually enfold life in the ever-expanding field of art and appear as an uncanny mixture of the animate and the inanimate. Not unlike Roland Barthes' description of the photograph, remarks Kenneth Gross, the statue marks an absence or a loss through the presence of a thing that is yet irremediably materially present. Through a statue, though a statue will tend to monumentalize and dehistoricize that arrest, conceal the absence in a way a photograph does not. If Zviagintsev's whale was a reminder of a gigantic loss regarding nature's ability to withstand the destructive forces of humanity, German's oversized statues appear on the one hand as the petrification of the stasis, arrestedness, superfluousness, or sheer inability experienced in a society confronting a world in continuous and violent change, incommensurate with the powers of individuals. At the same time, these statues bear the traces of both human creativity and destruction, making them objects animated through the conflicting affects they materialize in an anonymous and unqualified way. These are some depressed statues, one of the protagonists observes, translating the general affective charge of the sculptures onto a subjective level. Now, the affective qualities of the statuesque are further excavated in an astonishing poetic strategy of intermediality, this would be my last example, that we see in the Estonian film directed by Martti Helder, In the Crosswind, made in 2014. The film takes us back to the Soviet deportations that took place between 1941 and 1949, when tens of thousands of people from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were sent to Siberia on Stalin's orders for the ethnic cleansing of the Baltic countries. It presents the tragic story of a young couple and their young daughter whose lives are shattered when they are removed from their home and separated. The husband sent to a prison camp and later executed, the wife and daughter sent to a camp of forced labor. And the film begins with beautiful black and white images in which details appear sculpted by sharp lighting and convey a sensuous richness of an idyllic life in the country. So this is the first part of the film. In moving images, although I present these stills here. But as soon as the Soviet soldiers arrive, these moving images give way to a special rendition of Tableau Vivant. And I will show you this sequence. technique unfolds seamlessly from the tactile sensations of the opening photographic frames into a scene in which the actors stand still and the camera is gliding around them, stitching together actions usually shown with cuts in consecutive shots, thus transforming the photofilmic sequence into a single moving photo-sculptural tableau. Made at the time of the mass consumption of spectacular 3D cinema, this technique enhances not a theatrical cinematic experience by making objects seem to jump off the screen, but carves out the photographic stillness of the photofilmic image by creating a form that literalizes the petrifying effect of trauma and at the same time corporealizes and monumentalizes the evanescent moment captured by photography. It also blends the traditional figure of the living statues with one of the most spectacular inventions of digital cinema introduced by the Matrix movies, the so-called bullet time effect. This special effect of frozen bodies and flowing camera movements is described by Ivan Grosek as if we have entered a limbo between the movements of film and the otherworldly contemplation of a sculptural frieze, his words. There is, however, a fundamental difference from the Matrix-style bullet effect, in which characters are removed from the regular flow of time and we can contemplate their superhuman abilities. Characters here are frozen, but time is not arrested. Quite the contrary. They stand helpless and petrified in the crosswind of forces that will ultimately destroy their lives. The director, Marty Helder, declared that he devised this technique in order to transpose the essence of a sentence from a letter that inspired the movie, in which the young woman writes, "I have a feeling that our bodies have been brought to Siberia, but our souls are still in the summer in Estonia." Accordingly, these tableaux may also be regarded as a kind of ekphrasis, a way to translate onto the screen the poetry found in the archive material, letters, diaries, photographs that were used as the basis of the film. Or more precisely, these tableaux adapt and reverse the logic of ekphrasis to the rendering of traumatic memories themselves. As these images do not describe the experience of a palpable work of art, but they conjure up a palpable artistic form for an experience by giving substance to images excavated from archive sources and from personal memory in the form of statuary poses, as if they were physical objects. The affective, performative value of this objectification appears perhaps most strikingly when it is confronted with the depiction of, I quote, real objects in the scene in which the young woman is raped. As the camera leads us slowly from room to room, I can't show you the clip because it's very long, in the supervisor's house, inspecting everything, household objects, furniture, bookshelves, a bust of Stalin, the doors, the bleak walls on the corridor, the scene of the rape scanned in the same way at the end of the seemingly interminable visual inventory of every object is both eerily matter-of-fact and gut-wrenching. Now to conclude. This process of carving out photographic objects can be seen as something that again sheds light on an important aspect of all the images I try to describe. In films based on the post-media aesthetic of the tableau, even without major CGI technologies, images are no longer merely recorded, shot, but molded into a virtual container encapsulating a sensual universe of colors, shapes, bodies, sounds, displayed through the conspicuous mediation of high-definition digital cinema. modulating in between stasis and motion, stability and subversion of stability, the painterly pictoriality, photofilmic plasticity of the photosculptural and the photosculptural corporealization of the image. The cinematic tableau in all of these examples captures situations of powerlessness in powerful images and becomes a figuration that encapsulates both the vitality and the vulnerability of the world, a highly artificial structure in dialogue with the real. This crisp, poster-perfect tableau aligns with the much debated tradition of the picturesque, of the, I quote, good, unifying and reasonable forms proposed for identification that Lyotard speaks of in his essay on cinema. It is nevertheless a form that relies on the deep imbrication between traditional arts and new media, one that engages in the redistribution of the sensible by renegotiating its visibility in a gaudy post-media age through a form that is continually reloaded with unresolved tensions through the changing, not only shapes, but dynamics of intermedial in-betweenness. And this is
the moving film and the painting, the sculpture, and the modern and the classical, the melodrama, and so many other things that are kind of stable material in film studies, but also of other disciplines. So I think it's we have rich pickings here to propose questions to you. So it's now open for questions. While the floor is thinking, might I start by asking on precisely this vision of modernity and melodrama that you applied to the films that you were looking at on the basis of Kovacs and his understanding of
Beethoven, Grodal, I can't, there was no time on elaborating on this. Anders and Kovacs elaborates these ideas based on Torben Grodal's theory on melodrama.
I know most of the films that you discussed, and I was slightly surprised to see them referred as melodrama. I think that Timbuktu, for example, is quite dry. In particular, in the death scenes, there are a few death scenes where characters are suddenly shot when we least expect it to happen, without all that musical accompaniment, the tear-jerky tricks that we are so accustomed to in traditional melodrama. So I was a bit surprised with that. I also think that the gender politics that is at play in that film, in terms of the prettiness of the women, maybe it's just me, but I doubt it. I was struck by the beauty of the man, and in particular the father, who's gorgeous, absolutely, and he gets so many close-ups. He's a singer, a famous singer in Mali, and I think they are drawing very much on his fame as such. So I was just intrigued. Obviously, you approached this film in such a beautiful way, showing the thing about the painting, the strength of the painting, the pictorial, the iconographic, and the idolatry, and all of those things that I had not thought about. So perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more about that.
Okay, I agree with you on this gender issue. Yes, it's not only the women who are pretty in this film, so yes, I do agree with you on that one. Regarding melodrama, you must be aware that in his book on modern cinema, screening modernism, András Bálint regards, for example, the films of Antonioni melodramas. So modernist melodrama induces anxiety, not tear-jerking reaction from the audience. So this is how modernist melodrama works. There's something missing in it from the world, there's something gut-wrenching, but it induces anxiety instead of these operatic emotions. So that's why I meant that this is somehow in between. There's this huge destruction, this incomprehensible cruelty in this world, and you see these beautiful people. So there's this balance of power, but it is rewriting these the schema of melodrama. That's what my wording was. It is not a melodrama. It rewrites a scheme that we know from melodramas. So it's a different approach, naturally, that's what I meant. If I wasn't clear, I'm sorry. So that was my intention. So no, I wouldn't categorize it. It's something unique and disturbing. So it's like it induces an anxiety, but it also induces feelings, emotions from the spectator. So a mixture of elements taken from both types of melodrama. So this could be a postmodern melodrama, because postmodern melodrama doesn't exist. Postmodernism is not about being melodramatic. So maybe.
Thank you. John?
Also staying on the theme of melodramatic inheritance, I wondered if it's possible to reflect on the relationship between this extraordinary three-dimensional sculptural tableau that you've just shown us at the railway line, with the use of tableau in D.W. Griffith's Way Down East, where a similarly traumatic moment of separation is expressed through a tableau when Lillian Gish is sent out from the patriarch's home into the snow, that I'm sure that was a sort of theatrical inheritance straight into Griffith's film of Way Down East. I can imagine this was a tableau moment, as it was an enormously popular stage play before he made a film version. So I just wondered if that was an interesting touchstone or a point of contrast or comparison with the kind of tableau that you're thinking about at the end of the talk here.
I'm not sure you were asking me whether this had any connection with the Estonian tradition in theatre?
No, it was more about a sort of
or
international
filmic
tradition,
no.
or the extent to which film in those formative years, drew on a melodramatic tradition coming out of theatre, melodrama going back to the French Revolution and before, but particularly that very direct inheritance of stage melodrama into the film melodramas of D.W. Griffith, and the fact that certainly in that example of Way Down East, tableau is very, literally they really do turn it into a tableau vivant or a tableau moment. And I just wondered if that was clearly a non-postmodern moment, as it were, but whether there was an interesting kind of reflection to be made there about those two slightly related kind of scenes.
Well, I don't know. I thank you for the association. I think this is a very interesting point, a very interesting comparison. So, yes, something to be explored further.
Yeah, right, great.
Right. Any more questions?
I'm sorry, everybody's exhausted, and I think my talk was also a little bit longer than it should have.
Perhaps you were already answering all our questions in your...
That's what I was saying. It's a magisterial paper which, ranged across a number of different and very pressing issues for us when we look at film in the context of new media. So thank you very much, and you answered my questions, you know, so it's not just that we're tired, it's to do with the quality of the work that we've been able to witness. So thank you.
And it certainly didn't feel too long, it was absolutely riveting.